12 hours from now, the most consequential trade agreement in the Western Hemisphere since NAFTA takes effect. And almost nobody in the mainstream financial press has explained what it actually costs. Not the headline number, not the diplomatic language about mutual prosperity and strategic partnership. The real cost? The one buried in the technical annexes, the one that, when you trace its full implications through the supply chain architecture of South America's largest economy, reveals something that should fundamentally change how every serious analyst thinks about the future of American economic influence in Latin America. Brazil just made a decision that will echo for 30 years, and the clock is ticking. Let us start with what is actually in the agreement, because the official summary and the operational reality are separated by a gap you could drive a container ship through. The headline from Brasilia described a comprehensive trade framework with the Mercosur-EU arrangement that has been under negotiation for 23 years. The public-facing terms include tariff reductions on 91% of goods traded between Brazil and the European Union, market access for Brazilian agricultural products worth an estimated $45 billion annually, and EU investment commitments in Brazilian infrastructure of approximately 20 billion euros over a decade. Those numbers are real. They are also the least important part of the agreement. The clause that has received almost no analytical attention is the regulatory harmonization framework in Chapter 14, specifically Section 7, which mandates that Brazilian manufacturing standards in 12 critical industrial sectors align with EU certification requirements rather than American standards within a 48-month implementation window. This sounds technical. It is, in fact, the mechanism by which Brazil is choosing its long-term industrial patron. Here's why that matters. Standards are not neutral. They embed themselves into supply chains, manufacturing processes, capital equipment procurement, and engineering talent pipelines in ways that become structurally irreversible within a decade. When Brazil aligns its automotive components certification with EU standards rather than American standards, Brazilian manufacturers must now source testing equipment from EU-certified suppliers, hire engineers trained in EU regulatory frameworks, and integrate quality management systems designed for the European market. The initial capital cost of that transition runs to an estimated $7 billion across affected industries. But the long-term consequence is that the supply chain backbone of the world's 9th largest economy is systematically reoriented away from American industrial integration. The mainstream economic analysis of this agreement focuses on trade flows. That is the wrong unit of analysis. The correct unit is supply chain gravity. Brazil currently conducts approximately $29 billion in annual trade with the United States in manufactured goods. That figure appears stable. It is not. Supply chain gravity works through a mechanism that is invisible until it is too late to reverse. When your standards align with a different system, your procurement naturally follows, your engineering talent flows towards certification in that system, and your financial relationships deepen with the institutions that fund activity within that regulatory framework. The Congressional Research Service published an analysis in October 2024, estimating that for every $1 of standards harmonization investment a country makes toward a non-American regulatory framework, approximately $40 in long-term trade redirection follows over a 15-year horizon. Apply that multiplier to Brazil's $7 billion harmonization investment, and you are looking at a potential $29 billion annual trade redirection away from American supply chains within 15 years. That is not a trade loss. That is the elimination of a trade relationship roughly equivalent to everything the United States currently exports to Brazil in manufactured goods. Gone. Not through tariffs, not through diplomatic confrontation, through the quiet arithmetic of regulatory alignment. Think about what this means for specific American industries. The Brazilian automotive supply chain currently sources approximately 12 $3 billion in components annually from American manufacturers, primarily in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. As Brazilian OEMs transition to EU certification standards for components, American Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers face a structural qualification barrier that has nothing to do with price or quality. They simply will not have the right stamps on their certification documents. The jobs consequences in American manufacturing heartland states are not speculative. They are the predictable output of a supply chain realignment that is now legally mandated to occur within 4 years. The standards harmonization is the visible mechanism. The financial architecture shift underneath it is the more consequential story. Brazil is the anchor economy of South America. It represents approximately 38% of the continent's total GDP. When Brazil's industrial supply chains reorient toward EU frameworks, the financing of those supply chains follows. European development banks, primarily the European Investment Bank and KfW, are already positioned with combined Brazil commitments of 8 billion euros in infrastructure and industrial lending. American development finance institutions, primarily the Development Finance Corporation, have approximately $2 billion committed to Brazil. That 8-to-1 ratio in development finance positioning was already creating structural European advantage. The trade agreement now locks in that advantage permanently. But the more immediately consequential financial shift involves the currency composition of Brazilian trade invoicing. Currently, approximately 67% of Brazilian international trade is invoiced in US dollars, even when neither party to the transaction is American. This is petrodollar arithmetic applied to commodity trade. Because the global commodity pricing system runs on dollars, the intermediary currency for most international transactions defaults to the dollar regardless of the actual trading partners. As the EU trade agreement deepens and EU-Brazil trade grows from its current 58 billion euro baseline, the natural invoicing currency for an increasingly large share of Brazilian international commerce shifts toward euros. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimates that for every 1 percentage point reduction in global dollar invoice share, the United States faces approximately a 30 basis point structural increase in the interest rate required to attract foreign capital into Treasury instruments. That seems abstract until you multiply it. If Brazil's trade agreement is the leading edge of a broader Latin American shift, and the evidence strongly suggests it is, given that Colombia and Chile are in active negotiations with similar regulatory harmonization clauses, the cumulative reduction in dollar invoice share across Latin America over the next decade could force a 200 to 250 basis point structural premium onto American borrowing costs. At current federal debt levels approaching $36 trillion, 200 basis points of structural interest rate increase represents approximately $720 billion in additional annual interest expense. That is more than the entire discretionary defense budget. That is the real cost of the Brazil deal. Not $45 billion in agricultural tariff savings for Brazilian soy farmers. $720 billion in additional American debt service per year if the Latin American regulatory alignment cascade fully materializes. You might be asking why the 12-hour frame matters if the consequences are measured in years and decades. The answer is that midnight tonight marks the end of the ratification grace period during which any party can invoke emergency suspension clauses. After tonight, the agreement enters binding implementation. The reversibility of the standards harmonization commitment drops from theoretically possible to practically impossible. This is how strategic locks work in international economic architecture. You do not announce irreversibility. You let it accumulate quietly until the reversal costs exceed the political will to bear them. By the time the consequences of the Brazilian standards decision become visible in American manufacturing employment statistics, roughly 24 to 36 months from now, based on the supply chain transition timelines for automotive and industrial equipment certification, The political window for response will have long closed. The Peterson Institute for International Economics modeled 3 scenarios for the Brazilian agreement's trade impact in a working paper published in February 2025. The pessimistic scenario, which assumes full implementation of all regulatory harmonization clauses, projects a net reduction in U.S.-Brazil goods trade of $4 billion annually by 2035. The baseline scenario projects a $2 billion reduction. Even the optimistic scenario, which assumes significant American policy response, including a competing bilateral framework negotiated within the next 18 months, projects a $7 billion annual reduction. There is no scenario in the Peterson Institute modeling where the United States maintains its current trade position with Brazil after this agreement takes effect. To understand why Brazil chose the EU framework over continued American economic alignment, you have to abandon the notion that this was primarily a trade decision and recognize it as a sovereignty calculation. Brazil under Lula has been pursuing a deliberate strategy of strategic autonomy, which in the language of Brazilian foreign policy means the systematic reduction of dependence on any single external power. This is not anti-Americanism. It is rational portfolio diversification applied to geopolitical exposure. And the specific appeal of the EU framework over an American framework comes down to one fundamental asymmetry. The European Union does not have a Monroe Doctrine. Washington's traditional approach to Latin America has operated under the implicit assumption that the region falls within an American sphere of influence where U.S. strategic interests take precedence over Latin American sovereign economic choices. That assumption was sustainable when the United States represented an overwhelming share of Latin American trade and investment, when there was no viable alternative to dollar-denominated finance, and when American military and diplomatic power faced no credible counterweight in the Western Hemisphere. None of those conditions fully hold today. China surpassed the United States as Brazil's largest trading partner in 2009. Chinese investment in Brazilian infrastructure has reached $74 billion in committed projects since 2010. And the EU, through this agreement, is now offering regulatory integration that creates deeper industrial ties than anything the United States has offered Brazil in the past 20 years. Let that sink in. The largest economy in South America, in America's own declared sphere of influence, has chosen to anchor its industrial future to frameworks that systematically reduce American economic leverage. And it made this choice because the American alternative continued informal economic suzerainty without the reciprocal investment and market access that would make the arrangement mutually beneficial was simply no longer competitive. The EU agreement has consumed all the analytical oxygen. But the simultaneous deepening of the Sino-Brazilian economic relationship is the longer arc within which the EU deal must be understood. Brazil and China signed a comprehensive strategic partnership upgrade in 2023 that committed Beijing to $50 billion in Brazilian infrastructure investment over 5 years, with specific focus on port capacity expansion at Santos and Paranagua, railway development connecting the agricultural interior to coastal export infrastructure, and telecommunications network deployment in the Brazilian Amazon. Each of these investments increases Brazil's export throughput to Asia and reduces the relative importance of the North American market to Brazilian commodity producers. The agricultural mathematics are particularly stark. Brazilian soybean farmers currently export approximately 87% of their production. Of that, 70% flows to China. As Chinese-funded port and rail infrastructure expands Brazilian export capacity from roughly 220 million tons annually to the 280 million ton target by 2028, the incremental export volume will flow overwhelmingly toward Asia, not toward North America. American soybean farmers are not losing market share to Brazilian imports. They are losing long-term competitive position in Asian markets to a Brazilian agricultural sector being systematically equipped by Chinese infrastructure investment to outcompete them. Brazil earns, China eats, American farmers lose. And Washington's response has consisted primarily of tariff threats directed at the wrong addresses. 12 hours from now, the ratification window closes. But the real transformation operates on a 12-year timeline, not a 12-hour one. Understanding that distinction is the difference between analytical clarity and the kind of reactive policy thinking that has consistently misread Latin American economic realignment over the past 2 decades. The supply chain architecture of the Western Hemisphere is being restructured. The regulatory frameworks that determine who can compete in Brazil's industrial economy are being locked into EU alignment. The financial flows that follow those supply chains are being reoriented toward European and Chinese institutional capital. And the dollar's invoicing dominance in South American trade is entering a structural erosion that American monetary policy cannot reverse because it is driven by supply chain logic, not by financial preference. Here is what you need to understand if you are managing any exposure to this transition. The sectors most immediately affected are industrial machinery, automotive components, aerospace parts, manufacturing, and agricultural technology equipment. All areas where American firms currently hold significant Brazilian market position and where EU certification alignment creates immediate competitive barriers. The medium-term exposure concentrates in financial services where European banks are positioned to capture the project finance and trade finance relationships that grow with the agreement's implementation. The long-term exposure is macro, the structural reduction in dollar invoice dominance and its compounding effect on American borrowing costs. Tonight at midnight, a document gets signed. What actually gets signed is 30 years of industrial and financial architecture. And the 12-hour countdown was never really about the signature. It was about whether anyone was paying attention to what the signature actually means.